Hi Year 11 and welcome to our Cluster 3 video. So we've gone through 10 poems from the Power and Conflict Anthology so far, and we're going to go through the final 5 today. Ozymandias, London, My Last Duchess, The Emigre and Checking Out My History. So loosely base these around the concept of kind of humans, human power or lack of power, human experience. But as I've said previously, there are lots and lots of different ways that these poems can interlink together. So do keep the groupings kind of fairly loose. So first poem today, and I will apologise, I say Ozymandias. I know some people say Ozymandias. I don't really think it matters, but there may be some people on the internet who disagree with me strongly. But for the purpose of this, Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley, 1818. So in this poem, which I think we're all very confident with, the once vast statue of Ozymandias, who is an illusion. Ozymandias is Ramesses II, an Egyptian pharaoh, but it's being used as an allusion to King George III, or Mad King George as he was unkindly called, who Shelley is criticising in this poem. And this vast statue is now just a colossal wreck, reflecting the transitory, the kind of impermanent nature of power. The words on the pedestal, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty in despair," are hugely ironic because there's such a sense of power in those words, isn't there? That imperative, look on my works, you will do this. And yet nothing beside remains to make other people in society despair. These words also serve as a warning, and that's what Shelley is doing, is using them as a warning that all rulers will eventually share the same fate of essentially kind of like no longer existing. And so we need to think about the power of legacy. Is it about building huge statues and memorials to ourselves, or is it about the way that we treat people and the things that we do? And the natural image of the boundless and bare desert, please make sure you're spelling desert correctly, hints at the enduring power of time and nature over human power. So as always, 5 quotations for each poem. These aren't the right quotations, they're not the best quotations, they're just 5 quotations that came to mind when I was creating this. So 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone, that juxtaposition between vast and then trunkless, that there's just these 2 legs left. The sneer of cold command on the face, on the shattered visage, which is buried in the sand, and the idea of the cruelty of the ruler, which in some ways almost seems like karmic with what's happened to him now. The words on the pedestal that we've already talked about, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings," the religious imagery there, King of Kings, the hubris, "Look on my works, ye mighty in despair." Nothing beside remains, that immediate structural juxtaposition, and the lone and level sands stretch far away. I've gone for that one alongside boundless and bare. I like the plosive alliteration, and boundless and bare, it sounds quite aggressive and reflecting what nature has done to the statue. Here, I like the alliteration of the liquid alliteration of the lone and level sands stretch far away. That sibilance as well, creating the sense of just enduring nature, timeless nature. Second poem today is London by William Blake, 1792. So in this poem, which is a really great one to kind of remember because it's quite short, 4 stanzas, 4 quatrains, it makes it quite easy to remember. But in this poem, the city of London is characterised by helplessness, oppression and violence. This poem is all about the juxtaposition between the rich and the poor and the way in which the rich are mistreating the poor in society. And the occupants, the everyday people of the city, are miserable, and that's physically shown through their faces, which are marked with weakness and woe, both in terms of that could be like physical kind of diseases, but also just that sense of sadness. The soundscape of the city. Now, I've talked about soundscapes in some of my other poetic videos, and for Bayonet Charge, for example, and it basically means like the sounds that are just used and created. In this poem, it's really like we get very literal sense of sounds, which reflect the sense of misery that the occupants are enduring. So the infants cry, the soldiers sigh, and the harlots curse. And this is happening to every, because that's a quotation, single person. The blood on the palace walls is a violent allusion to the French Revolution of 1789, and Blake is kind of using it as a warning to his readers that this may well happen. If it's happening in France, which is a very close geographical neighbour, it could well spread over to the UK if we don't change things. And the ending of the poem is quite apocalyptic, blights with plagues and marriage hearse. It suggests this sense of impending doom and turmoil for society, almost that we may die out if things don't change. If we think about the oxymoron in marriage hearse, marriage connotes new life, new starts, new possibilities. Hearse is associated with death, obviously. 5 quotations. I wander through each charted street near where the charted Thames does flow. That's our first 2 lines. Please remember that it's wander rather than wonder. So we've got that real sense of like purposeless walking. The speaker feels like unable to do anything to help this situation. They also feel a lack of power. We get the repetition of charted on charted street and then charted Thames, showing how the rich in society are attempting to control everything, even something as powerful as nature. Marks of weakness, marks of woe in every face on the street. So that repetition of marks, emphasising their distress in every voice, in every band, so that we get some anaphoric repetition of the in every, showing the impact that it's having on everyone in society. The hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. The line before that has been how the chimney sweepers cry, the blackening church appalls. So we get this sense of who is not helping in society. The church, the monarchy showing through the palace walls, the government showing through charted. None of them are helping the people that they should be. And then that final line, so how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. And we've talked about how we'd analyse that already. My Last Duchess, Robert Browning, 1842. So this entire poem is told from the Duke's perspective. It's his dramatic monologue, and in it, it kind of appears to present him as polite, and flattering and like thoughtful, but actually it becomes very, very clear that this is all an act and he's actually really possessive and controlling. And Browning really cleverly shows that through the structure that he uses. So the iambic pentameter, remember that da-dum, 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 of the lines, which are supposed to represent normal like speech pattern. So it makes it appear like the Duke is just casually talking, but that juxtaposes the rigid rhyming couplets that are used throughout. And that shows that whilst he's trying to appear natural and conversational, he's clearly thought and carefully planned what he's going to say, creating that sense of control and rigidity. Within the poem, the Duke is obviously fixated on his last wife, his Duchess, who is no longer with us, as suggested by the use of the word last. But he goes on to then admit that he gave commands because he didn't like the fact that she was smiling at other people, that she had a heart too soon made glad. So he gave commands and all smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive. So it quite clearly implies that he had her, or that he ordered her murder, and yet he feels this sense of patriarchal power that he can admit to this in a roundabout way because nothing's going to happen to him due to his power. Now, what's really interesting here is obviously he's not only talking to an envoy arranging his next marriage, but he also uses this final image, or Browning uses this final image of Neptune taming a seahorse. And I always think that's really interesting because it shows the Duke's desire to control everything around him. So he is Neptune, that all-powerful Roman god, taming a seahorse. If we tame something, particularly like a wild animal, we essentially break its spirit, we break its nature to utilise it for ourselves. What I do think is interesting there, though, is you could interpret it the other way, and you could say that through the whole poem, he is so fixated on a woman that is no longer alive, that is permanently haunting him because she's painted on a wall. There's no removing that unless you paint over it. And in this metaphor, this final metaphor of Neptune taming a seahorse, is she not still fighting back? Is the fact that he's obsessed with her memory not a sign that she still wins out over the Duke, even through death? Just something to consider. 5 quotations. I talk about this more in my video on the channel already. So we've got "That's my last Duchess" painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. There's some interesting things to talk about the fact of the context surrounding why she's painted on the wall. Obviously, the possessive pronoun "my last Duchess" is really important. "Wilt please you sit and look at her?" So it seems he says this to the envoy. It makes it seem polite, like he's giving the envoy a choice. He absolutely isn't. It very easily reflects his controlling nature. This isn't a question. This is a closed question because no one else speaks in this poem. The envoy has no choice but to sit and do as he's told. "She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed." So this is our rationale. This is the reason the Duke gives for why he basically has the Duchess killed, because she's too nice. And we obviously realise that as a reader, we're like, what are you talking about? Like, you are absolutely psychotic. And the irony there being that the Duke very much feels like he is the victim in this situation. "I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together," as we've said already. Now there she stands as if alive. "Wilt please you rise?" So that really, again, emphasises, subtly emphasises the fact that she is dead on his orders. And then that final metaphor we've already talked about, "Notice Neptune taming a seahorse, which clouds of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me." So, The Emigre by Carol Reumans, 1993. This is a gorgeous poem. It's one of my favourites, although I know that students don't tend to like it as much. But there is a video up on this, a longer video, if you want to learn some more about it or just refresh your revision. So in this poem, the speaker of the poem is in some sort of exile from her childhood city. There once was a city, I left it as a child. There once was a country, sorry, I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. And there's some really interesting ideas here that it's never mentioned what place this is. By not mentioning it, it makes it universal, and therefore we could apply it to any kind of situation where tyrants and like awful power structures have taken over a country and isolated its people. So there's lots of juxtapositions between light and darkness in this poem, which help create this sense of ambiguity. I'm never quite sure whether this poem is an expression of hope and strength or whether it's an expression of sadness and desperation. And that's okay. Just like in the unseen poetry, if you are not sure, you can talk about how something is ambiguous, how it could be interpreted in two ways. In the poem, though, what is absolutely clear is that the speaker's memories of her country, of her city, are vividly associated with sunlight and colour. She cannot forget its beauty. She cannot forget what it once was, even if things have all gone like really badly now. And she talks about how her mother tongue, her original language, has been banned, but it remains unforgotten. It tastes of sunlight. There are 3 stanzas in this poem, and every single stanza ends with the word sunlight, which could help to make us think that this poem is supposed to be about positivity and hope. But I always think the final line, "My shadow falls as evidence of sunlight," could be interpreted more negatively. And there's, particularly in the final stanza, there's some really strong personification of my city, where her city comes to her, it takes her dancing, it's really personified to show that strong emotional connection felt between the speaker and her homeland. So 5 quotations for this poem. There once was a country, I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. So that's actually, they both run on from each other there, 1 and 2. And I think that's so important. That caesura that's used, there once was a country, comma, that pause, I left it as a child. The use of once, past tense, but that idea of the sunlight coming through. She goes on to juxtapose that with saying it may be sick with tyrants. It may now, that metaphorical image that the city, the country is ill, like it can no longer be well, and yet she can't forget it. She can only remember the positives. The personification of her city, my city takes me dancing. There's something joyful, celebratory, intimate about that. And that's then juxtaposed with the they circle me, they mutter death. And I've always said in recent years, I've really changed how I interpret this. I always used to interpret it as they, that third person pronoun, was speaking about the people from her original country, like the tyrants. And then actually, because of events that have kind of happened in the recent world, I've actually thought, is it a commentary on how we treat like refugees, how we treat migrants? Because if you're an emigre, if you're emigrating away from a country, you have to become an immigrant when entering another country. And we know how our media and our society tends to treat those people. And so actually, I've started interpreting this poem that it's perhaps a criticism of how we treat those who are seeking like help because of traumas that have happened in their home countries. But as I said, that's very much my interpretation. You don't have to agree with me there. So our last poem, Checking Out My History, John Agard, 2005. I think one of everyone's favourites, a fantastic, fantastic poem. And such an important one for showing ideas about like power and powerlessness and kind of like taking back power as well. So the poem opens with an immediate juxtaposition between them, the educational establishment, and me, the speaker. Them tell me what them want to tell me. The metaphors of a bandage and being blind are then used to emphasise how the educational authorities have deliberately separated. This is obviously one person, but obviously that one person is representative of a whole generation and more of individuals who've been separated from their own cultural and historical awareness due to our desire in this country to only teach Eurocentric history. Obviously, this was published in 2005, and it's John Agard reflecting back on his experiences growing up and being educated in British Guyana, which was obviously a British colony. But it's still, we are trying to be better in the educational system, but there is still absolute relevance and truthfulness to this day, isn't there? So the poem itself is a ridicule and criticism of the Eurocentric history tour. And the reason I've put history in inverted commas is because we get references to like 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, and we get references to some other kind of historical events, the man who invented the balloon, but we also get references to Robin Hood and Old King Cole and the dish that ran away with the spoon and the cow that jumped over the moon. So what Agard is trying to show is that we're being taught like ridiculous kind of mythologized British history and people who might not have even properly existed, rather than hearing about incredibly important like global cultural figures like Toussaint Louverture, Nanny de Maroon and Mary Sokol. And his tone is really angry about that, but also it's one of celebration and pride in those historical figures that he wants to learn about. The poem itself is super important in terms of how it's written, so the rejection of grammatical conventions, what we might call standard English, so the use of or the lack of punctuation throughout, the use of the like I dialect with dem, so it's written how we might say it in a dialect, all goes to show that kind of criticism of the educational system, and that's contrasted with the use of the free verse, so the non-rhyming, and the italicized stanzas about the Black historical figures, and that creates a really powerful, authentic voice. So I think I could maybe quote the whole of this poem, but just 5 quotations. Dem tell me what dem want to tell me. Bandage up my eye with my own history, blind me to my own identity. Think about the aggressive, plosive sounds on bandage and blind. Like we put a bandage on something when it is injured. Who is it that's doing the injury? Well, it's the educational system anyway. And then blind me, there's something even more like violent about that, isn't there? If we think about how important our eyes are, our vision is. Toussaint de thorn, so we get this beautiful metaphorical imagery around our powerful global figures. That idea of him being a thorn in the side. There's that idiom is there, isn't there? That kind of metaphorical phrase. If you're a thorn in the side, you're a problem to someone. And Toussaint was a thorn to the French. He was a figure of rebellion to those people trying to control them. There's a lot of light imagery that's used around the Black historical figures. So Toussaint is a beacon, Nanny de Maroon is described as a firewoman, and Mary Sokol is a healing star and a yellow sunrise. So that, as we've talked about previously, the imagery of light being associated with enlightenment, truth, hope. And then there's the final line of the poem, so powerful and moving. But now I checking out my own history, I carving out my identity. And I think the use of the verb carving there is super important because it's not always easy, it's not always straightforward, but it's something that he's committed to doing. Apologies because this is currently 17 minutes and I know that's a bit too long, but I get carried away. I know I'm an English nerd, but hopefully this has helped, and watching all 3 of these will hopefully make you feel confident going into that literature paper 2 exam. You've got this. Keep using our YouTube channel. Remember to like and subscribe if it's helpful, and yeah, as I've already said, you've got this, guys.